Delighted to be here again, and I'm going to talk to you about a trip that you can see on the screen. My wife Hannah and I took in October, November of 2012, and I just realized how long ago that was as I was putting this together. It's amazing how time flies, and was a Cheeseman trip, and you might have heard that name because there are a couple in that family that show up often at Santa Clara Audubon meetings, and they're here tonight, and Gail and Doug, and it's a delight to see them. This trip, the leader on it was Ted Cheeseman, their son, and it was an amazing trip. You'll see we went around the well. Let me back up. The reason I signed up for this trip was not because I knew Gail and Ted and Doug, but because a photographer friend of mine, Artie Morris, had sent me an email saying, I know you hate boat trips. However, if you ever want to go on one to see a penguin, this is the trip you should go on because South Georgia has more mass of life on it than any place else in the world. And you don't have to go to Antarctica because the passage across Antarctica can sometimes be bumpy. Um, so um, so I signed up because Artie said to do that, and he was also on the tour. So anyway, here we go: South Georgia and the Falkland Islands. If I can, now I'm discovering that I'm going to have a little bit of trouble. Oh, maybe enter. Here we go. So here's kind of the description of what we're going to talk about tonight. To get to South Georgia, um, the um, the you generally start off from the Falklands, and to get to the Falklands, we were told to go to Chile, go to Santiago, and then the group would assemble there. Because if you missed your flight from Santiago to the Falkland Islands, you'd miss the boat and you'd miss the whole thing. So it was good to get the whole group together in one place a day or so early. And we got into Santiago 2 days early. And so we did a little bit of touring around there, and I'll show you that. And then we'll talk about on the way to South Georgia, a little history of South Georgia. It was an old whaling and sealing place, and it has a lot of history. Um, if we're going to go to South Georgia, we better spend a little time on penguins. And so we'll do that. And then other birds like, albatross and stuff. Um, I want to spend a few minutes on rats and mice because they're so important to to the 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 health and welfare of the birds on South Georgia, and talk a little bit about that. And then we'll finish up with going back to the Falkland Islands. So there you have it. So, as I said, we stopped a few days in Santiago, which is up here in Chile. Chile is a very narrow country. And so it gives you the advantage that if you're staying in Santiago, one morning you can get in the car and drive up into the mountains, and the next morning you can get into a vehicle and go out to the shore, and so you get dramatically different birds and habitats and everything else. So we did that, and just to show you the route we took from Santiago, we flew down to Stanley in the Falkland Islands. And then in Stanley, we picked up our boat, which was called the Ushuaia, and we went around South Georgia, which is out here. came back and spent a little bit more time on the Falklands, and then went down to the city that was named after our boat, or vice versa, called Ushuaia in Argentina. So that's kind of the trip. So here we are in Chile, and we're starting up the mountains. And my goodness, what a dramatic uh, view it is, going up into the mountains with these glaciers coming down. This is where Santiago gets its water, and consequently, there are some lakes high up in the mountains that store the water that goes down to the city. And on the way up, we stopped along a rocky edge of the road um, to see this little bird, the mustache turca, and it's belongs to the Tapaculo family. And the Tapaculos, as I've mentioned in other talks that I've given, are mostly little tiny gray, brown, black birds that hide in the shrubbery, and they're impossible to see. And their name Tapaculo roughly translates to hide your behind, and that's what they do. But this Tapaculo is about twice as big as the other Tapaculos and three times as bold. And it was taking care of a family, and you can see it had some worms or some caterpillars in its beak, and it's quite nice to be able to photograph a Tapaculo like that, because they're so hard to see otherwise. As we got up, we were headed for a lake, the lake that provide one of the lakes that provides the water to Santiago, and we began to see a few raptors flying by. This is called a variable hawk, and there's a dark phase and a light phase, and so this was the light phase, is quite striking, and then here we are at the lake, and you can see down in the bottom, there's a lake here, surrounded by these mountains with snow and dumping water down in. And over on the bottom right, there's a marsh, and that's where we were headed. We were headed for the marsh, which had a few kind of special birds in it. One of the first birds we saw was a synclodes. And you'll see synclodes appear several times in this talk. They're remarkable birds. There are about 10 different species, if I remember right. And this one, its habitat is rushing water at 13,000 feet up in the mountains. And it's all the synclodes, they belong to the ovenbird family. It's not like our warblers, not the ovenbird warbler, but this is a whole family, that family of birds that builds the nests that look like um, old Basque ovens with a hole in the side. So I don't believe this one builds that kind of nest, but it's still in the family. So anyway, this synclodes lives very high up in the mountains in the cold, and it does just fine, thank you, up there. And um, as I said, we'll see several other synclodes as we go along. This was a new family for me, the seed snipes. And this is about it's about the size of a rock pigeon. It's a pretty good sized bird. And I've seen several now members of this family in Chile, but this one was up in the mountains and posed for us, and it was very exciting for me to get to see a seed snipe. I never dreamed that I would, and there it was. But the bird that we were really looking for was the diademed sandpiper plover. And it's named this because the early discoverers of this bird didn't know whether it was a sandpiper or a plover. So they decided to just hyphenate it. It turns out the DNA people now have figured out it belongs in with the plovers, but it doesn't have a plover bill. It has a bill that's very much sandpipery. You'll see the bird on the bottom is engaged. It has rings on its legs, and this is because there are a number of ornithologists studying these birds because they're not um, seriously endangered, but they're vulnerable, and they're kind of mysterious because there are habitats like this along a mountain lake where the birds are very happy to be. And indeed, this bird had a chick, and so they were nesting and breeding here. And then there are other lakes with the same habitat where there are no sandpiper plovers, and they can't figure out, what encourages them to be in one place and not the other. This is the only sandpiper plover, and it's a cool looking bird, I think. So the next day, still in Santiago, we said, all right, we've seen the mountain birds. We spent a whole day up there. Let's go and see all the birds of the shoreline. And so we did. And most of them are right here on this rock. These rocks you can see are covered with guano, and a lot of the rocks off of Chile have been mined for guano for fertilizer. So you can see pelicans and gulls and cormorants and so forth, and give you a little bit closer look here. I always like to see birds who are named for the place that they are. Unfortunately, we were in Chile and we were looking at Peruvian boobies and Peruvian pelicans, but we were in Chile. And down on the bottom is quite a striking cormorant, striking when you compare it to our kind of all black ones. It's got red legs and red face and a lot of interesting white markings on it, the red-legged cormorant. So these were on the rocks, and also there were gulls that looked dangerously like our western gulls. And their voices were similar, but they're maybe a bit blacker on the back, and these are called kelp gulls. And there were quite a few. They're pretty common along the coast of Chile. The most gorgeous tern you've ever seen, the Inca tern, was nesting underneath a restaurant on a dock there, and with a red bill and a yellow whisker, all charcoal on the back. It's a really striking bird, and so it was fun to see them, the Inca tern. And oh my goodness, here's another Synclodes. So now let me tell you about this Synclodes. This Synclodes lives on the shoreline. It lives in the kelp that's washed up along the ocean, and it eats the small creatures that are in the kelp. And there's no water, no drinking water, no fresh water in this area. So this bird has to get its water from seawater. Well, you would think that would shorten its life significantly, but it's evolved a giant kidney, and its kidney rejects salt. And so, as opposed to some seabirds that have special glands up in their skull near their nose that reject salt that way, these reject it through the kidney. So this Synclodes has evolved to get along in its habitat, 13,000 feet different from the previous one. Okay, so I want to give you a little bit of a map here. We're we're going to fly from Santiago down to, whoops, the Falklands. And then from the Falklands, we're going to go almost 1,000 miles to South Georgia. Now, I mentioned already that I don't like boat trips. I get violently seasick on the way to the Farallones every time I go. Um, I've begun to decide it's from diesel fumes, but for whatever reason, I was dreading this a bit. I had patches that I put behind my ears, and we ultimately got on the boat and went off to South Georgia. And about 5 days after I'd gotten on the boat, the ship's doctor came up to me. The ship's doctor, by the way, was an amazing woman from South Africa, I think, who'd been trained in all kinds of rescue operations, parachuting down to critical places and saving people's lives, just, just one after the other, no problem. So she looked at me and she said, "Bob, you better remove those patches. They'll irritate your skin." And I said, "I'm doing fine. I haven't been seasick. And I don't want you to talk about these patches. They're psychological now." They did fine. Anyway, uh, so this is a picture partly to show you this is Antarctica down here. And the Antarctic circumpolar current goes around the globe, around Antarctica. And it's what separates Antarctica from the rest of the world, kind of. So the warmer currents don't get down to Antarctica. And this separation here happened, this is part of the old continent of Gondwana, my favorite continent. About 40 million years ago, Gondwana broke apart here, and this current started to flow. So you can see the current is flowing this way. Now I've got one more map here that shows a little bit of geology. So this part of Gondwana that split up and went north is called the South American plate. And the part that stayed there is the Antarctic plate. And when they separated, another plate went zipping through called the Scotia plate. And the Scotia plate was scraping up the bottom of the ocean as it went along, and it moved out here. And ultimately, it ended up leaving kind of a refuse here of these islands. And one of these islands is South Georgia. And the importance of all this is that this Antarctic current flowing across here, carrying nutrients and so forth, rises up from pretty deep out here. And then it gets to this point and it gets pushed up. And all those nutrients come up towards the surface. And that's what feeds everything which lives on South Georgia, which is and everything that swims around South Georgia, which includes whales and seals and sea lions and elephant seals and a lot of birds and penguins and so forth. So that's the reason that this is as cool as it is. This little point here of Elephant Island, we'll talk about in a little bit, because that was a very important place to Shackleton. And Shackleton is a famous name in South Georgia, so we can't totally ignore him. All right, so finally, I got on a boat, and much against my better judgment, and off we went. And so here we are, headed from the Falkland Islands, going towards South Georgia. And it was a typical, nice, pleasant morning on our way. It took 2.5 days to get to South Georgia, and the ship was a Russian ship. The captain was Russian. The crew was The kitchen crew and so forth was mostly South American, and we had a lot of support staff for the tour, led, as I said, by Ted Cheeseman. But there were several professional photographers and professional ornithologists and so forth. So a lot of people who knew a lot about where we were going, and we had lectures in the evenings and learned about what we were doing. So I'm happy to move to the next slide because I'm beginning to get a little queasy. So from the back of the boat, you could get down almost to water level, and you could look out from the back. And I had brought with me two Canon cameras. At the time, it was a 7D and a 1D Mark III. And I had a couple lenses. One was the 100 to 400 zoom, and I had a 400 DO. Um, all of these were the initial version because this was in 2012. Um, so uh, most of these taken from the rear of the boat were done with the Mark III and the 400 DO. I I'll comment. I never liked that first 400 DO lens, um, but I had it, and so I was using it. So this is black-browed albatross, and these birds were often seen from the back of the boat. So we had a number of birds kind of following us, or occasionally not following us, but just showing up and looking us over and moving on. And so if you go down, there were several photographers hanging out in the back of the boat, just trying to get what we could in terms of these birds. This is a small bird, nowhere near as big as the albatross, called a Cape petrel, and um, and they're often in flocks, and we saw quite a few of them. This bird is as big as an albatross. It's a huge bird. It's a giant petrel, and there are two different giant petrels, the southern one and the northern one. And this, you tell them apart by looking at the color of the tip of their nose. And I guess this one has a little bit of a greenish tip to it. I can't remember which way it goes, but one is green and the other is pink. And I think the southern one is green. The southern one has two color morphs. So one is dark and the other is white, like this. And this one is uncommon. So it was exciting to see this. And when it flew in behind the boat, everybody went running to see the white Nellie, is what the whalers called this bird. Um, so southern giant petrel, and it's a very big bird. So then on about the third day, we saw a cormorant, except they don't call them cormorants, they call them shags. And cormorants aren't pelagic the way these other birds are. They like to have land to roost and nest on. They do, of course, they're fish-eating birds, um, but they like land, and so seeing the South Georgia shag meant that land was nearby, and indeed it was. Um, so this is El Sahul, which is at the western end of South Georgia. So this was our first port of call. Finally, we were seeing land, and we would get off here, and we would walk up this little path here. Up to, no, we didn't do that. No, we found a nice beach place, and we got off there, and I'll show you. Oh, I wanted to show you first. This is South Georgia, and so the trip. started out coming from the Falklands here, and we landed in Elsahul, which is here, and we bounced our way down the kind of the north coast. And the north coast of the island has a lot of landing places on it. And this is where all the whaling and sealing happened from. And because you can land there, you can get off. And each one of these little names along here was a place where the boat stopped and anchored, and we got into a Zodiac and we went out and landed on the shore and then walked off and looked at penguins and things like that. And we landed every single day, sometimes twice, which is a real applause for Ted and the whole crew, because um, the trip that went after us was a Chinese trip, and they landed once on the whole time. Now maybe we were lucky with the weather, um, but our captain knew to keep us in the lee of the island all the time. So the weather was coming from down here when we started out, and we were over here. And so we worked our way down along the island, and then we went around on the south side. And on the south side, there are very few landing places. And so the sealers and the whalers didn't land here. And this is important for the story about rats and mice that comes later. So anyway, we got all the way up here and back up to the end again. And the captain said, well, we have a little time. We've done so well on this. We didn't have to wait around for anything. Where would you like to go? And we said, well, we'd like to go back down here. And so he said, sure, no problem. And so we went back down here and then back up again. And then we went back to the Falklands. So that's kind of the story of it. It was quite something to do all this. So that's our boat. And it's here in the harbor, and this is where we are going to go up here now. It's not as steep of a walk as what I was fooling you about. And so we'll land there and get off. Now to get there, what we do is a dinghy, a Zodiac comes by. They're loaded up on the back of the boat, and we climb down an outside ladder, and there's what they called an able seaman. And the able seaman is standing on the ladder, and he grabs your arm like this, and he passes you to another able seaman in the Zodiac. And you don't have to do anything. You just get tossed from one to the other. We didn't lose anybody. Um, and those guys are strong people. So anyway, here we are. We've managed to be passed by our able seaman into this Zodiac. And then the Zodiac comes in, and we were told there'd be wet landings. The boat had many, many pairs of boots, and we wore waterproofs and boots and so forth. And we were taught how to disembark, so nobody went in face first, and we ended up out here. And then we were free to explore. Just remember to come back in time to catch the boat going out. But explore we did. And I said we had some professional photographers along with us. And so on the first stop, a photographer named Tom Murphy, who's famous for Yellowstone photography, was with us, and he pointed out these whale bones with this seal and the composition and so forth. So I took the picture. This is an Antarctic fur seal, and the Antarctic fur seals were almost extinct because of the sealing operation that went on. But today there are about 2 million of them, and almost all of them are on South Georgia. And the timing of our trip was planned so that we arrived before the fur seals began to get too loaded with testosterone. So the fur seals establish territories, and they get very protective of the territories. But when they first get there, they're kind of calm and just hanging out, and it's not so tough. Later on, towards the very end of the trip, um, we had to carry a tripod or something with us just to kind of convince the seal that he didn't want to take a piece of your leg or something. So Antarctic fur seal. Here's one close up looking straight on. They have a lot of fat in them, and they're quite the males are quite aggressive. Okay, so we managed to get to South Georgia. Let me tell you a little bit about the history. I'll do it quick. It um, was a sealing place for most of the 1800s. And finally, most of the seals had been taken, the fur seals. And as I said, they were almost extinct. And then the Norwegians built a whale oil factory to render whale oil. And for another 50 years, it became a whaling station. It's famous for the turn of the century, well, actually around 1916, for Shackleton's efforts to try to go across Antarctica and go to the South Pole and doing it. And it also got involved in the Falklands War, which happened in 1982 between Great Britain and the Falklands. And Great Britain won the war, and it used to report to the Falklands, and South Georgia did. And after the war, it was made a separate territory, a separate British territory. So there are a lot of things like this. Um, Ancient whaling vessels that ran aground or were no longer being used and were left because there's nothing else to do with it. They made nice perches for the shags who nested on them, and kind of interesting from viewpoint. So Shackleton, over here on the right is Shackleton's grave marker. He's buried in South Georgia, uh, and because he wanted to be buried there. But his famous trip, where he was going to hike across Antarctica, never got to Antarctica because he started out in the middle of summer, which was December there, and he went in this route here, and his ship, the Endurance, got trapped in ice. And so in January, middle of January, they were trapped in ice, and they couldn't do anything but just move with the ice. And the ice moved them along until October, so 10 months later, when the ship was crushed by the ice. So the crew got off and got on the ice floes, and the Endurance sank, and they rescued what they could, and they camped out on the ice floes. And they ended up finally reaching this. They got in a launch. They had rescued the lifeboats from the Endurance, and they got to Elephant Island. So they were actually on land then, and they were there for a fair length of time. And then Shackleton and 5 sailors got into a lifeboat, and they rowed. They didn't set sail. They rowed for 16 days and got to South Georgia. And then turned out they wanted to get to the whaling station, which is called Grytviken. And Grytviken is on the north side. They landed on the south side. they had to hike 32 miles up over that ridge of mountains and down to get to the whaling station, which they did. And then they set out to rescue the rest of the crew, which was on Elephant Island, and it took them 4 more months to get back to get the crew, who had been surviving on eating penguins and seals, and were very delighted to see Shackleton finally. Nobody died. Everybody survived the thing, and Shackleton was knighted, and it was an exciting thing. So when we got to Shackleton's grave here, everybody gets a little tot of whiskey, and we toast Shackleton and thank him for making it possible for us to be here. The elephant seals. Um, well, what can you say? They're huge. The southern elephant seal is twice the size of the northern elephant seal. This is a female, so she's not so big. But when we landed in some places, the entire beach would be covered with elephant seals, and we'd find a little kind of pathway to go between them, being careful not to get in between two males who were maybe huffing and puffing at one another. And then we could get on the land side of the elephant seals, and and that would be okay. So here's the male with this big trumpeting nose, and the female, and half of the world's population is on South Georgia. And as I said, they're huge. They're huge. There's a lot of old equipment in the town, the abandoned town now of Griegviken. That's where the whaling station was, and there are tanks and stills and rendering vessels and all kinds of things like that that must have done something. So imagine all this iron had to be brought from Norway, yeah, I think it was the Norwegians who did this, or the Danish, all the way down from Scandinavia, all the way down to Antarctica, and assembled and built up to make the whale oil. So enough history. Um, so this is one of the places on the north side called St. Andrews Bay, and these are king penguins. They're 500,000 on South Georgia. These are about 3 feet tall, and we were told to stay, I've forgotten now, it was so long ago, but I think it was about 15 feet away from any animal. So you'd sit down in the sand 15 feet away, and the king penguin would come up to you and investigate what you were doing. So it was all right if the penguin came to you, but not if you went to the penguin. So the penguins, these king penguins, are breeding on South Georgia, and they during a breeding season, they pair up for breeding season. So serial monogamous means they have one mate during one breeding cycle, and the next year they may change or they may keep the same mate. But it takes 2 of them to raise a kid, and they lay 1 egg and have one youngster. The breeding cycle takes more than a year. It takes up to 16 months. So they can't breed every year. And that's partly why the breeding success is only about 30%, because some of them try to do so when they still have a kid that they're trying to get fledged, and they're also laying an egg, and that doesn't work out. And here are some penguins. So this is one of the penguin colonies, and the black and white penguins are the adults, and the brown ones are the kids. And what happens is the adults go off to fish and then come back and regurgitate this partially um, digested fish into the kid. And when they come back, this adult penguin has to find this kid here. And apparently, they say they do it by sound. Well, the cacophony here of sounds going on was amazing. So, how an adult ever finds their kid, I don't know, but they do. Here's another view. This is called now I've forgotten its name, but this tufted grass is about 3 feet high. You can see the penguin standing next to it, and walking through these grass tufts was very difficult. We tried to hop from top to top to top, because if you dropped down, sometimes you ended up in mud and sludge that was over your boots. So you had to be a little careful. So here's a close-up of a penguin. It turns out that the yellow on the penguin is an indicator of age, and the brighter and more yellow there is, the older the penguin is, and the better mate it makes because it's more experienced. So the old penguins are the good mates. I like that idea. Here's, yeah, they live 15, 20 years. Here's a penguin feeding his kid. Um, the feathers are really important on an adult penguin. So the kids can't go in the water, because if they went in the water, they'd get waterlogged and sink. And and so these feathers are waterproof. And as it says here, they have 4 layers. So the outer layer is waterproof, and then the inner layers are the insulation. The penguins have to get new feathers periodically. This is a group trying to decide who's going to go fishing first. When they go together. And part of the reason that they don't all just freely go into the water is they're leopard seals, and leopard seals eat penguins, and so you have to be careful what you're doing if you're a penguin. So I said you lose your feathers every now and then, well, every year. And it's called molting, just like our birds here molt. And when they molt, they can't go in the water. And it takes about 10 to 15 days to do a molt, and so they don't eat. So I was told they were quite grumpy when this is going on. Now, the ornithologist that told me that, I don't know how he knows grumpiness in a penguin, but they look grumpy because they're just standing there, and they really don't move much. And these are all feathers, all on the ground here. We had on this trip, we had a woman who was the head of the uh, birds and mammals department from the Vancouver Museum in Canada. And she got interested in the molt and was trying to calculate how much material got transferred from the sea to the island by the molt process. So as obviously as penguins come up and they're also defecating on the land, and so there's guano and there's the feathers and all this business, but that's what fertilizes the land so that this grass can grow there. Here's another penguin who's in the midst of molt. These guys are through molting, and they're getting ready to risk it. Um, and it's quite a sight to see him. This is not a penguin, but it's another family of birds, the sheathbills. There are 2 species in the sheathbill family, and this is one, the snowy sheathbill. And their primary food is penguin droppings. So there's still something digestible in the penguin droppings, and so they're scavengers, the sheathbills, and um, and you find them in penguin colonies. We found one snowy morning sitting on the Zodiac on our boat, which was cool. So there are other penguins besides the king penguin. They're Gen 2 penguins. They're smaller. It only takes them about 80 days to fledge, and they lay two eggs. And their nests are generally made of stones. And the stones, you can see a lot of the stones are very large and they're not usable for nests. So the job is to find a small round stone and carry it over to the nest and pile it up and make this nice nest. And here are a couple of them heading off looking for stones. And here's a nest. So they make this nice nest, pile the stones up, and then another penguin from another pair comes over and takes a stone. And so then there's a lot of argument, and we heard a lot of squabbling going on between penguins. And it turns out that some penguins kind of decide to heck with it all, and they build their nest out of mud and grass. And it's the same species, same thing, and it seems to work all right, and they lay their eggs there. So maybe eventually they'll branch apart, and you'll get two subspecies or something. Here we are aboard the ship on a snowy morning, and we're getting ready to go ashore. Um, yeah, they said we can go ashore, and if we go ashore, there's some macaroni penguins there, and you might not see them otherwise. And so they swept off the zodiacs, and down we went. So here we are climbing down. You can just barely see somebody coming down this ladder and then being dropped off into this zodiac in the middle of a snowstorm. I really wanted to see a macaroni penguin, so I did it. And I figured it might be the only chance I get. And here was a macaroni penguin. This is a place called Cooper Bay, and they nest right in the snow. And well, it was neat to see them. So these have a different bit of yellow in them. About half of the penguins in the world have yellow ornamentation, and the other half don't. Who knows why? Here's a Gentoo penguin. They were actually tobogganing down the down. They waddle up and then slide down the hill. We saw one chinstrap penguin, and this is it. Um, I apparently they either our timing was such that they weren't there, or almost all the chin straps are on Antarctica and are not on South Georgia. But it was cool to see one, and to get to this chin strap penguin, I had to go by a fur seal who was now testosteroned up. So I just wanted you to know that I took my life in my hands here to get this picture. Chinstrap penguin. All right, there's more than just penguins. There are also albatross, and they were nesting. We were on a small offshore island to see this bird, and the albatross. This is a wandering albatross, so it's one of the biggest of the albatross. Um, take quite a few months to fledge. So the parents are off fishing, the kid is sitting alone. So it's very important that they be in a predator-free place, so that they, can grow up without getting picked on by something. So hence it was this bird was on a small offshore island where there were no rats. There are rats. There used to be rats on South Georgia. There were rats when we were there. Um, Here we're on an island called Prion Island, and you remember we looked at the white Nelly. There was a giant petrel. Well, this is the dark phase of a giant petrel. And, um, and there are many of these birds on both the Falklands and on South Georgia. And as I said, they're very large birds. The wingspan is what, 10 feet. We got to see a lot of different kinds of albatross and petrels around South Georgia. There are some small albatross. So this light mantled albatross is a relatively small one. And here's another, oh, this is a close up to show you the salt excretion tube. The gland is up here in the forehead, and then the salt comes out this tube. So they also drink seawater. That's how they get their water. The skua is an impressive bird. So it's like a big gull. If you've been on pelagic trips here or out of Monterey, you might have seen a skua. This is a brown skua. It's a little bit different one. Quite dramatic wings, and these two were nesting or getting ready to establish a nest anyway. So there was a lot of planning and design work going on, and they had a lot to say. Here's another view of the skua. This is South Georgia cormorant, so a shag, and striking blue eyes and these, what do you call these things? Carunculations over the bill. And this is on one of these shipwrecks. So they hauled grass up there, made a nest, and there they are. There are terns, there are Antarctic terns, but it also turns out that there are Arctic terns. So Arctic terns migrate all the way from the north, all the way down to the Antarctic. And you could tell the Arctic from the Antarctic because the Arctic terns were then in their non-breeding plumage, whereas the Antarctic ones are in breeding plumage with a black cap and so forth. But otherwise, they look almost identical. A little bit of glacier or sea ice. So we'd be out in the zodiacs going around here looking for some of the seabirds. This is another one of the bays on the north side. So one of the many places where you can actually land. And at this place, we decided we'd go in to see if we could see the nests of the gray-headed albatross. And to do that, we actually had to climb up one of those hills to get into this tussock grass. That's what it's called. And so these tussocks created kind of nesting places where the albatross could settle in. Here's a shot from the boat. And here's a wandering albatross in flight. This red on the side is from the salt that gets excreted by the bird out of their tubes there, and gets blown back and catches up here, and it's an red algae kind of thing that collects in the feathers. Wandering albatross. This is, I think, one of the prettiest birds there, the snow petrel, and pretty dramatic. And these pintails are also native to South Georgia. Okay, so quickly, the business of rats. The British decided that they would eradicate the rats on the island because as you went around the island here, you saw very few small pelagic birds. And I'll show you some in a minute, until you got around here. And then once you got around here, you began to see these birds. And the reason was that there were no rats here because there were no ships landing here. And there was a glacier in between that protects the ratty areas from the potentially ratty areas over here. And the rats don't cross over the glaciers. And each one of these little areas here was a separate area separated by glaciers, so they could remove the rats one place at a time and get rid of all the rats. And they did a major multi-million-dollar project that I'm proud to say a foundation that I'm on, the Farallon Islands Foundation, paid to have Cheapman, which is right here, deratted, and also Iris. So we participated in the deratting program. This is Cape Disappointment, which is right on that eastern end. And as you come around, you get into the rat-free zone. And we began to see these birds, the Antarctic prion and so forth. Um, and so they deratted, they removed, and these slides are not mine. But there are 13 species of petrels are vulnerable to the rats and so endangered on South Georgia. The South Georgia pipit had lost almost all its habitat. It was mostly on little offshore islands. And they did a huge thing with helicopters and dropping pellets. And it started in 2011. They did it in 3 stages. 1, 2, 3, and finished it in 2016. They had dogs come back onto the island to search for rats, and they put things called gnaw sticks and everything else. And when I made this, I put no rats in 2018. That was the first decision they made, but there's still no rats. And they have very rigid monitoring now of landing on the island and so forth. So the results have been extremely successful in that the South Georgia pipit has come back. The yellow-billed pintail is increasing. The small seabirds that are broadening out their territories, and it's going well. So I can't resist saying this. Closer to home, the Farallon Islands are infested with house mice. We put them there when we were egging or doing other fishing kinds of things and landing on the Farallones. The mice escaped and ended up covering the Farallon Islands with themselves. They're threatening nesting seabirds, including the ashy storm petrel. Half of the ashing storm petrels in the world nest on the Farallones, and Fish and Wildlife is trying to do a mouse removal program, and there are a number of organizations listed here that are supporting it. But unfortunately, Wildcare is opposed to it, and they've been relatively successful politicking against it. And the Coastal Commission is one of the things that has to, or preferably would approve it. So we'll see what happens. There's more politics to get through, but my own personal view is it would be really good if we could remove the mice from there. And finally, I'm running a little late, but the Falkland Islands here, we spent a few days on the Falklands, and the Falklands also have mice and rats. And so we went to these little islands, New Island, Steeple Jason Island, Sea Lion Island, and so forth. And there are a lot more species of birds on the Falklands, but there are a lot more birds on South Georgia. In other words, there are thousands of one species of penguin on South Georgia, but there are lots of different species here. So we began to see, because it's a little bit farther north, a little bit less difficult climate. So the Magellanic oyster catcher, there's a penguin that's very similar to the Humboldt penguin called the Magellanic, and it nests in burrows instead of collecting stones. There's a wren that looks, it's very closely related to the house wren and was once thought to be a house wren. There's some colorful finches, here, canary winged finch, and there's several different kinds of geese, these strange geese. Some of them look like this for the female, and the male is white, and others, both the male and female, look like this. So the ruddy-headed goose is both sexes are like this, but the upland goose looks like this. And I think there's one other goose, if I remember right. And look at this, here's another Synclodes. And this Synclodes lives in those tussock grasses, and that's its habitat. And so the Synclodes family has evolved and spread out into all these different species. Very cool. Cormorants. We found a snipe, but unfortunately it wasn't the South Georgia snipe, it was the South American snipe. And there are some pretty ducks. The dotterel is a plover, and quite colorful. There are a couple of plovers there. These are all in the Falklands, all these birds. And this is the predator on south or in the Falklands, the striated caracara. It will predate young penguins and other young birds, and it's also a carrion eater. Here's my wife in the tussock grass, and she's looking at 180,000 pairs of black-browed albatross. And it's a pretty amazing sight. Here are a pair of them reinforcing pair bonds by billing. And here are here is the albatross colony. And Hannah was looking from the tussock grass out on this colony. You can see these mud piles here. The mud piles are the nests, and each one is sitting on a nest over here. Then it started to rain while we were there, and all the albatross jumped off their nests, and they got down in the mud in between here because now it was muddy, and they started picking up mud and piling it up on their nest to build up the nest a little bit more. So they were very alert to it. These look like macaroni penguins, but they're rockhopper penguins, and there's a colony of them. Here's one with an egg, and they're excited about that. Cormorants, the king cormorant is a little bit different species. And then we found spider crab. And here we are headed back to the boat for the last time, and suddenly this crab showed up. So it was I thought this was neat because they aren't going, ew, how awful. They're excited about seeing some new form of life. So new island, and we're headed now back to Ushuaia. The birds are saying goodbye. We're arriving in South America, in Argentina, and the crew is saying goodbye, and I'm saying goodbye. I appreciate your listening to me, and we sure appreciated the Cheeseman family and the crew of the Ushuaia for making it a great trip. Thank you.